Jennifer Pills. I see so many familiar faces. If this is your first time attending an Africa Hub event, we're glad you're here to celebrate Women's History Month with us. The MU African Interdisciplinary Studies Hub promotes interdisciplinary collaborative research and teaching that contributes to a better understanding of Africa at the University of Missouri. For the past few years, we have hosted an event during Women's History Month. We are excited to continue with tonight's event. As many of you might know, I served as a Peace Corps volunteer in Mali in West Africa, 92 to 94, and that's where I developed my love for Africa. We would like to thank our sponsors tonight for their generous support: the International Center, the School of Health Professions, the School of Social Work, and the Public Health Program, and the Central Missouri Return Peace Corps Volunteer Association. Tonight, I'd like to welcome Pat Westhoff. He is the president of the Return Peace Corps Volunteer Association, and he served as Peace Corps volunteer in Guatemala from 79 to 82, and he is the current director of the Food and Agriculture Policy Research Institute at MU, and he is going to welcome our speaker tonight. Let's give Pat a warm welcome.
Tell me how long ago it was I was in Peace Corps, Pennsylvania. Welcome everybody tonight. Glad to have the opportunity to introduce Dr. Warren tonight. So Nicole Warren is an associate professor at Johns Hopkins University School of Nursing and a certified nurse midwife providing antenatal, postpartum, and well-living gynecological care at the Johns Hopkins Hospital. Dr. Warren has over 21 years of combined research, clinical practice, and fieldwork experience in women's reproductive health. Her focus is on reducing barriers to quality reproductive health services, through improving care for women affected by female genital cutting. Her emphasis on respectful maternity care and eliminating the mistreatment of childbearing women has been incorporated into two of the first female genital cutting training curriculum in the United States. She's an award-winning teacher with specialized training in service learning and pedagogy. She has collaborated with the World Health Organization, Centers for Disease Control, and the Department of Health and Human Services Office of Women's Health. Joining me tonight, welcome Dr. Warren.
I have no problem projecting. So if I'm too loud because of this mic, let me know. What's it like for you guys in the back? It's okay?
Yes.
Okay. Hi, everybody. I was actually not sure until you reminded me about the arch that I had been in Missouri before, and I have not, I couldn't have hoped for a warmer welcome. I figured out this morning that I was here as a kid because of the arch. I do remember being there. So it's a pleasure to be here. My son's really excited because he's following this election really closely, so he's very excited because it's your primary day. So we're looking forward to results. All right, turn my phone off. Do you guys still hear that music? So, we'll compete with it if we need to, but hopefully I can keep you distracted. Okay, so thanks for coming out. I know this is a week, at least in Maryland, I can sort of feel the crescendo of tension around coronavirus like really changed just palpably in the last couple of days. And I don't know if you feel it coming here, but it definitely is around. So, okay, so thanks for coming out. Hopefully this isn't your last public gathering for a while. Okay. So, I'm going to talk about respectful maternity care, but that's a pretty straightforward title. But I'm going to try and weave in a few other things to kind of tie in the Women's History Month idea, as well as service learning. Can I get like a quick vibe? How many people are students? Yeah, and then just like health professions, like any nursing students? Okay, any medical students? Okay, and then what other kind of students do you? Public health, sociology, like what else do we have?
Public health.
Public health?
I'm a communication major.
Communication?
Political science?
Political science, cool. Political science, how do you guys with that? Journalism.
Social work?
Nice, okay.
Elementary education.
What kind?
Elementary education.
Nice, okay. And I know we have some faculty in the room and some providers. We had a genetic counselor earlier. Any other providers? Nurses, yeah. Midwife, doc? Cool, okay. So good, we have a nice spread. You haven't turned on. Oh yeah, oh, down there. Oh, okay, that's why I haven't. Okay, thanks. Before I begin, I do have to thank Jennifer Phil-Schoolvalley, who has just been an amazing advocate in getting this set up and making sure the resources were here to have it happen. And she certainly did not work alone. And I know that you already mentioned the organizations, but I also wanted to call out Najej Uwase, who I don't think is here, but helped a lot with the organization. So thanks to everybody who supported it. Okay, so let's get started. First is a bit of a disclaimer and a gratuitous image of my child, who is now much older than that. I put this up here for two reasons. It's just to remind me to make a disclaimer. This is Women's History Month, and so I'm going to talk about women. But I think we know that we are not being inclusive in that language sometimes. And I know in my own work, teaching nursing, which is part of how I spend my time, I have really been called to task by advocates of people with uteruses who do not see themselves as women. So I'm going to, for this talk, use the term women and lots of she's and hers, and I think I'm doing that sort of in a nod to the gestalt of Women's History Month, but I say that with a little bit of hesitancy, knowing that that's not the most inclusive language. So if you hear me say things like childbearing parent or client, I'm trying to be more inclusive. The other caveat is that I'm a middle-aged white woman from Ohio. I have not been affected by female genital cutting. I'm not a woman of color in the US who's had to face a health system coming from that perspective. And so I can only speak from my perspective, and you may be sitting there with quite a different one, either from the color of your skin or the discipline that you represent here. And you might like some of what I say, and you might not like some of what I say. And I welcome that feedback, because over the years as I've gotten feedback, it's been really helpful and helped me reframe things. And so I welcome things that you have concerns or questions about. Okay? So as always, we try and frame things in as broad a picture as we can. So I'm going to start with a couple of quick nods. One is to the Sustainability Development Goals. I think we are year 4 into these. Anybody already familiar with Sustainability Development Goals? Cool, okay. So they're big, broad, literally global goals of health, and I think what is helpful to me when I read those targets and those indicators and talk to students about how the work that they do at an agency, in their public health course, or on a cardiovascular unit in an ICU, how we are slowly chipping away and helping collectively to get to those indicators and targets. And that in all the work that we do, even if it's in political science and economics, we are helping move toward the achievement of these goals. And I think sometimes we get a bit overwhelmed with our tasks, and if we recognize that in solidarity we will hopefully get to some of these achievements. The other one is that 2020 has been declared the year of the nurse and midwife, and that is really an overdue but important nod to the fact that nurses and midwives make up, in some cases, 50, some estimates say 80% of some countries' healthcare systems. They're literally the motor of healthcare systems around the world, and they need to and should be working collaboratively with other disciplines, but I give this talk sort of in recognition of my own disciplinary focus on nursing and midwifery. So I was trained as a nurse and as a nurse midwife. My role now is as a faculty member, so I teach, I do research on things related to reproductive health, and I see patients just 1 day a week. So I'm doing a lot of things, and usually it feels like I'm not doing any of them particularly well, because I'm spread a little thin, but I would not trade that, because I feel like each activity feeds into the next and keeps me energized. So that's some of the hats that I wear. And not, of course, a Peace Corps. Someone had asked me the other day, someone's kid was interested in Peace Corps, and I said, do you think it's worth it? I think it's worth it. It completely changed my life in a lot of ways, and I think whether that's Peace Corps for you or some other kind of immersive experience in some community where you were not initially comfortable, I think that is the key. Sustained engagement in a community where you are not in power, and to do that for an extended period of time, I think that's where you learn things that probably are useful. And so whether that's Peace Corps or some other form, I invite you all to leap off the cliff if you're a little hesitant, because it's probably going to be worth it. Peace Corps is just one way to do it. So I'm going to put these in the context of, so this is kind of a global context, but thinking about what's happening nationally and also thinking about what's happening a little more locally. So there are lots of maternal mortality and morbidity stats that we can look at. I just pulled this down from the CDC last night. Whoops, where's that little button? Pulled this down from the CDC last night because they're so good about refreshing their data. And the point here is that even when you compare states with very high maternal morbidity mortality to states with low rates, we see that there is a consistency in the disparities. There is a ton of data, and I'm not going to present lots of it. I'm not an epidemiologist, but I think for me, what sort of drives my practice and my interest is in addressing those disparities. I say that knowing I'm not personally affected by those, but I feel like I'm in the right lane because I provide care and I work with people, and I can use my power and privilege in some of those spaces to hopefully address disparities. Am I doing it successfully? I don't know, but I do think the disparity issue is one where our tolerance is falling, and that's a good thing because the problem is persistent for sure. And on a nice note, I was in some student groups earlier today. Did anybody a Lauren Underwood fan? She is a very exciting congresswoman from Illinois who today dropped what they're calling the Momnibus, which is an omnibus. This is a bundle of bills. This is the Momnibus. And because it is a package of bills that literally read like a fantasy list of maternal health legislation. Like if you wanted to fix what is threatening vulnerable, and I say, look, if you want to fix the disparities we talked about, and you passed all these laws, we could like all go home tomorrow. Now the issue of funding them and implementing them is going to take a whole nother set of initiatives. But the fact that Lauren Underwood is in Congress and made this happen is already a step in the right direction. So I don't want to sugarcoat, it's not going to be easy, but it does have attention now, and I think we have got to build on that momentum because we haven't seen it quite as well articulated in the legislation as we do now. So I'm going to talk through a couple of sort of bigger ideas and try and make a case, connect a little bit to service learning and think about women's history in all of these topics. So two things I want to present for you. Some of you are already going to be familiar with them. I'll give you sort of my take and how I think they're connected. The first one is the Respectful Maternity Care campaign, and the second one is thinking about women and girls affected by female genital. This is a really recent piece of data. I think this came out last summer. This was a global campaign. I think it was done with text messaging. It was, so obviously that doesn't include everybody in the world, but you can see that they asked people in mostly low resource settings what is most important to them about their care. And I will reveal what the results were. So that is such a striking finding for me. In the US, we usually can cover 2 and 3, usually. 1, we don't always come through there. But I think sometimes, because we have the luxury of having things like 2 and 3 pretty well covered, we sort of sometimes think that not doing number 1 that well maybe isn't as serious a problem. And I think, the global maternal mortality rate has fallen precipitously over the last several years, and that's a wonderful thing globally. But it has, that progress has stagnated. And there are maternal health leaders who suspect that just getting women into facilities with the right provider, with the right skills, with the right resources isn't enough. If she is there with all those right things, yet she has a very negative experience with her provider, next time she has a baby, she might say, you know what? I was fine, the baby was fine, but I don't like how I felt, and I'm not going back next time. And then she has a complication, and she didn't go back, now we're in trouble. And so we don't see the manifestations of disrespectful care right away. Sometimes we do, but sometimes they take a reproductive trajectory of a single person's life to really come home to roost, and I think that obviously that's going to be hard to measure. So the idea of obstetric violence is old, and that's not new, but when we talk about disrespectful care, it's not like no one has mentioned that this is a problem before. Obstetric violence has been talked about a lot in the literature. Amnesty International published this report in 2009, and basically the take-home point, and you just get the PDF offline, it's easy to download, they talk about the disparities in maternal health care. This is in 2009. This is way before Serena Williams had her very negative health care experience. This is way before Shalon Irving from the CDC died. This is, precedes that. In 2010, Bowser and Hill published this landscape analysis. USAID was putting out a big call for grants, and this kind of preceded it. And they did an exhaustive review of the literature and said, what is going on with this thing called disrespect and abuse? Did all of you have certain papers or things that you read where they were so they impacted on your thinking and your life so much that you remember where you were when you read them, or you remember copying it, or you remember printing it, or some way it sticks in your mind when you actually read it? Does everybody have something like that? I was in like this crazy cabin with my in-laws in like rural Ohio for a very unwelcome weekend camping trip, like a whole family thing. And I had printed this PDF just before I left. And I just remember, it was like, this is what I'm talking about, but I hadn't had the language for it yet. And Bowser and Hill really, I think, kicked off a movement because they were able to articulate something that Amnesty International had been talking about and others had been alluding to. They really started to give it a language, and I think that that's where the respectful maternity care really got going. At the time, I was working, still doing some work in Mali, and we had done a lot of work with midwives, and it's funny, I have this mentor who loves Mali a lot and speaks Bambara, and I said, we can't put negi negi in the title. He's like, oh, why not? Sure you can. Negi negi means to kind of like, the translation is to cajole. And so these midwives, in talking about the care that they provide for people, we would ask them, how do you get women to sort of do what you think they need to do in labor? What do you do when women aren't doing what you think they need to do? And they talked about the techniques that they used. And they would say that they negi negi them, so they cajole them, kind of sweet talk them. But they also described what we would, I think, readily identify as abuse. They talk about slapping women, hitting women, holding them down, shaming them, threatening them, and that's really just all part of the job. It's as much a part of the job as the sweet talking and the cajoling. And anybody who I think has ever been a parent and had a frustrating moment with a kid, you know that sometimes you are sweet talking them and other times you say, you know what, enough is enough, and we do other things. So this is just human nature. We're all human, and we have fuses, and they can be short sometimes. So this is not to demonize providers, but just to understand how can we help control our humanness when it is directly impacting people in our care. So this is tough because we adore some of these partners that we have. This is Salimata Chari, who was a mentor to me in Peace Corps, and the reason I became a midwife. And I saw her birth lots of babies, and I saw both sides of her. And I could see this in providers in Congo, in Haiti, in India. What all of those frontline providers share is that they have an enormous responsibility. They usually have very limited support, very limited resources, no breaks, sometimes no salary. I mean, I would be stressed out too. So she is both of those things at the same time. So what is this thing, this disrespect and abuse I keep referring to? This is a sort of famous definition by Lynn Friedman, who's based in New York. And she talks about this being defined as interactions or facility conditions that local consensus deems to be humiliating or undignified, and those interactions or conditions that are experienced as or intended to be humiliating or undignified. It's a great definition, but there's a lot of room for, what is the consensus? So first of all, you have to find out what that consensus is, because I could think something was offensive, but maybe the patient didn't, and vice versa, right? There are intersections. And then, not just that we're intended to be humiliated, but even experience that. So it's not about intent, it's about how it's received. So it doesn't matter if you didn't mean to offend me with that comment. If I did have a bad experience because I heard it, that's what counts. Intention is not enough. We have to be thinking about impact. And frankly, tired providers have difficulty sometimes hearing that. I know I do. And I know that it gets tougher to hear the more fatigued I get. So a lot of this discussion gave way to this charter, called the charter, the Respectful Maternity Care, the Universal Rights of Childbearing Women. And so this campaign to sort of eliminate abuse and disrespect and promote the rights of childbearing women was really exciting, mostly led by women health leaders in low resource settings, low and middle income countries. This is not a sign you're going to see up, unfortunately, at Johns Hopkins Hospital or here in Columbia. But I think you can look at those, and don't those look familiar from like Patients' Bill of Rights and other documents that you either share with patients or sign yourself when you go to see a provider. So none of this is like really rocket science. It's just been repackaged, put into a childbearing sort of set of terms, and it's used as a reminder. In the global south, the low and middle income countries actually are miles ahead of us in acknowledging this problem of abuse and disrespect. We can just call it mistreatment. In the US, we again kind of say, well, you know, the quality of care here is pretty good. If she didn't feel great about that conversation, it's kind of like not my problem. Well, it might be your problem. It might be our problem. So how do these rates sort of line up with the categories of disrespect? So this kind of matches the two for us. And you know, in that last definition, that Friedman definition, you talked about a local consensus. So mistreatment looks different in each place. Right? If you slapped a woman here, and you'd probably get sued, right? I don't know if you'd get sued, but certainly there would be a problem. You can slap and hit women in other places of the world, and that's not a problem. In fact, their mother-in-law who's sitting right next to you might encourage you to do it again or harder. So it really is local. But make no mistake, we mistreat clients every day, grossly. And I've talked to a few student groups today, and I'll talk a little bit about the data that we have collected that is alarming, but also a good point to start from in terms of moving forward. So this respectful maternity care starts to gain speed, and WHO publishes this new framework for how do we define quality care for women and newborns. And I know this is very WHO-y, it's a little like wonky, not very exciting, but I want you to sort of take note. They put provision of care, which I sort of see as like the technical aspects of care, the right drugs, the right time, the right intervention, all that good stuff. They put it on the same plane as experience of care. That is new and that is important. To say that the way we made someone feel is as important as the technical things we did, that felt new. Now this is WHO. WHO's documents are lovely, they're great to help us start writing papers, but they feel very aspirational because they're hard to achieve. But I want to make sure that you know that they weren't way off in left field. If ACOG, which is the organization that guides a lot of clinical care in the US in terms of women's health care, they have put out these bundles that are designed to address maternal morbidity and mortality. And so they go everything from like cardiovascular disease all the way to the reduction of peripartum, racial and ethnic disparities. And this bundle speaks specifically, it lists like, I think it's 13 or 14 specific things that a healthcare facility should be doing to address disparities. And on that list, it talks specifically about understanding women's experiences, having data dashboards for when that experience is not positive and how it's being addressed, how are people being held accountable. So this is ACOG lining up exactly the kind of priority that WHO is giving. So RMC means respectful maternity care, but yet it's a term that we don't hear used much in the US, right? Maternity care. Now I want to talk a little bit about female genital cutting or mutilation. The language, you see FGMC there, I'm going to say FGC, female genital cutting. There are many women and girls who've been affected by this practice who feel mutilated and prefer that terminology. There are also many people affected by this practice who are very happy with the status of their genitalia, thank you very much, and to call it mutilation or to call me a victim is quite frankly completely insulting. So I as a clinician, when I care for patients who I think might have been affected and I'm going to screen them and proceed based on what I find out, I'm not going to start with FGM, right? I'm going to first of all ask them what they call it. You know, sometimes I understand I've had other clients from Ethiopia, and some of them have been affected by female genital cutting, and usually there's like a furrowing of the brow, and I'll say some people call it circumcision or female genital cutting or mutilation, and I'll throw out a few terms, and they say, oh, you mean here's what? And I'm just using that as an example. And I say, oh, what? And then I write down that term, I'm golden. That's all I have to use now. Because she told me what is acceptable to her because she's using it. So we can let the patient be the expert, takes us off the hook, and what we do is preserve the relationship. It's a respectful term because she showed me to use it, and that means I can continue to talk to her about how it might be affecting her, and very importantly for the feds and everybody else, if she is having a girl child, now I hopefully have a rapport that is strong enough I can now talk not just about her health, but so I noticed the ultrasound you're having a girl. Have you thought about her cutting status? To know if that kid might be at risk, right? And if I burn that bridge by using the wrong language when we first started talking about it, that's going to cost me an opportunity to do some really good counseling. So, okay. So, female genital mutilation, this is WHO definition. They use the M term, but there is the definition for you. And I would stress the non-medical reasons. I'm not going to go through the graphics. All of you may have seen those articles. They're very easy to get online. That's sort of not what we want to focus on. But just to give you a quick overview, there are 4 types. The 4th type is sort of a catch-all category, and it includes things like piercing, pricking, cauterizing. So technically, labial and clitoral rings are considered by WHO's definition FGC, FGM type 4. And you can find that in ICD-9 codes and encode that. Types 1 through 3 sort of go from 1 to 3 in terms of severity, 3 being the most severe where there's actually an obstruction. And the first type is taking off just a portion of the hood of the clitoris. So where is FGC happening? This is not a great map sort of to really, if you're interested in specific countries, but the reason I like it is because it demonstrates this is not a uniquely African practice, and that's very important to understand. We love to scapegoat Africa for all kinds of things, but I'm sorry you can't do it for FGC. Okay? And the other thing to take into account is that it's certainly not all of Africa. It happens in about 28 African countries, and I think there are now, I want to say 51 countries in Africa. So individualize your interactions with communities. So whether you are providing legal services, you're providing financial services, you just can't assume things about clients, right? And we have to do the same thing in healthcare. This shows you in a little more detail the range of the national prevalence rates. So they go from, what's the highest one up there? 91, Niger is really low at 2, Chad's actually practically a little bit newer. So even within that strip where FGC national data exists, varies tremendously. But unfortunately, even these data are grossly unreliable. The reason being is that national prevalence rates completely mask the socio-demographic drivers of the practice. Your ethnicity, whether you live rural or urban, whether your family is rich or poor, whether you've migrated to the US or not. Those are different kinds of families typically. And these national prevalence rates don't take that into account. It's literally an average. And we know that averages have weaknesses. But it does give us a place to start, and that's pretty much all it gives us. Because if you look just at this closer, this shows you how dramatically the prevalence rates vary even within a pretty small region of the African continent. So again, individualize, individualize, individualize. And importantly to understand, again to make that point, this is not uniquely in African practice. This was a report put out in, I want to say this is 2017, and they found that 70% of girls in Indonesia have been subjected to some degree of FGC. I can tell you for sure, Customs and Border Patrol is extremely interested in pulling aside West African families to talk about what they're doing when they go on vacation, and if they're cutting their girls, they are not pulling aside Indonesian families. It's just considered an African practice, which is false. The other thing is to keep in mind is that in the U.S., female genital cutting clitorectomies were performed in the U.S. and paid for by Blue Cross Blue Shield up until the 1950s. Someone corrected me previous talk, and she said she has a citation for the 60s. So there are a certain number of women of an older generation who experience clitorectomies. You see equipment for and descriptions of that procedure in gynecologic textbooks from the UK and the US. They're not in there now, but they're there. I mean, the history is clear. And clitorectomies were performed sometimes for little girls that seemed to be masturbating too much. They suspected maybe they had some lesbian tendencies or just behavior issues they couldn't otherwise sort of figure out. So we have our own experience with toying with the clitoris as a way to control behavior. And so to sort of other it is pretty inaccurate. So I think that's important. So if you want to know about the clinical care, here are your two best resources. The one on the left really just lays out guidelines. This one is more recent, and it is literally at 3 in the morning when someone walks in your door into a clinical setting, if you're headed in that direction, this is what you want. I will warn you though, it's like a 400-page PDF, so don't press print unless you have a lot of toner. It's beautifully laid out, but it's just inefficiently laid out. I highly recommend that you just save the PDF, make sure that your colleagues know where it is, because at 3 in the morning, this is what you want. It actually breaks things down by chapter. You can find things very quickly. Anybody could use this guide, whether you are sitting in Chicago or like Lagos or rural like DRC, it would serve you. It's in English and Spanish and Arabic, and it is literally like the best thing to happen for FGC-related care in many decades. So wonderful tools to make sure you're aware of it. I'll say just a very few quick words about the practice. The practice, it has affected about 200 million girls. We think it continues. The overall prevalence rates are falling, but total fertility rates being what they are, the overall numbers of affected women and girls is going to rise. Even though communities are doing it a little bit less, the communities are growing in size. Does that make sense? So the overall number is going to grow. About 75% of FGC is conducted by non-medically trained providers, so there's a large number of, but the rate of medicalization, so a trained provider doing it, is growing over time, not shrinking. And the trends are cutting at younger ages, fewer ceremonial aspects are associated with the act, and motivations. I don't want to. But the motivation for the practice varies tremendously. It varies as tremendously as the procedure itself, but it usually has a sort of an undercurrent and a foundation related to social acceptability. But as families migrate and move, become rich, become poor, move into the city, move out of the city, their motivations for the practice, they're really re-examining why they're doing it and does it make sense. What made my daughter marriageable in rural Mali is not the same thing that makes her marriageable in living in Baltimore. And families are smart, they learn that, and they change their practices. But because that's really, really hard data to get, we just are left with a lot of fear and not very many answers. The CDC is starting a multi-site study, but even that is like so fraught with fear. I'm just afraid they're going to do all this work and the data is not going to be that useful. So if you want more up-to-date information, this is the resource for you. Population Council probably does the best work, most evidence-based presentation. So if you ever want more information, that's it. So how many people are we talking about? It's about 500,000. That has gone up. The first estimates were in the late 90s, and the first estimate was about 169,000. And someone redid the stats in the early noughts, and it was about 228,000, and now we're up to about 500,000. Obviously, there have been huge immigration changes in this administration, so there has been not the same exponential growth, but who knows what will happen. These are the states that have laws. So the states in red do not have an anti-FGM law. See, Missouri does have a law, so congratulations. Michigan did not have a law until a Michigan physician, Hopkins-trained physician, was arrested for performing FGC on girls in Detroit. And Michigan said, oh my gosh, we should have a law. So they got on that. That case was actually dismissed a couple of days ago. The federal government declined to defend their national FGM ban because when they tried to prosecute the doctor on the basis of the federal legislation, they argued that it didn't actually have jurisdiction at the state level. So it was completely thrown out, and the feds declined to defend their own ban. So basically nothing happened. And the physician who conducted the practice, her defense team, they never said she didn't do it. She did the cutting. They were in India, and they were an Indian group called the Dwudi Bora sect. Say it again, please.
That would be Bora.
Thank you very much for saying that more efficiently than I did. And what was surprising about that arrest, it was not an African community. And it was like, oh my gosh, we thought that was just Africans. This was a trained physician doing it. This was not the old lady with the, the knife that is projected in a lot of the descriptions of practice, although it's a reality for some girls. And the pediatric community hasn't really been in this game. And this is a pediatric issue. She was cutting little girls. All the work that's really been done in the health professions has been done in the OB-GYN sort of space. And the pediatricians were like, whoa, wait a minute. We need to be in on this. And they are in on it, and I'll describe how that's happening. So what do we know about women who are cut? What are their obstetric outcomes like in the U.S.? This is obviously a quick talk. This is a snapshot. But there are multiple studies to suggest that they are not very good. These are getting old, though. Probably the best study was done in Washington State, where they compared outcomes of white women, women of color who had FGC, and the outcomes got worse as you moved from one group to the next. Okay, so it looked like cutting maybe was even more problematic in terms of outcomes than just being a woman of color, so some intersectionality happening there. We know that women's experiences of their care is very negative. We did, this was a pretty crude synthesis. There are so many qualitative studies to demonstrate that women are screaming at us, your care stinks. They know our health system is better. They know we've got the blankets and the meds and the rooms are clean and the toilets work, and that is a wonderful change. Sometimes if someone is a new immigrant, obviously all these women are not, but for people who are really new to the healthcare system, they appreciate the technology and the high level of care, but when it comes to FGC, they know, and they're right, we don't know what we're doing. And that creates fear and distrust that really makes providers super anxious and frustrated, and then you've got the families that are frustrated and anxious, and this is not a good recipe. And then providers' readiness, this is just one study. There are many studies that demonstrate providers are not ready to provide this care. They would love more information, but the way we give information to them is even pretty haphazard, not well evaluated, and we're trying to correct that. So I talked about RMC, right? I talked about FGC, and I want to kind of start to link this back to service learning to start to bring this home. So all of this was happening kind of like early 2010s. I was new in Baltimore, kind of figuring out my way, really getting turned on to respectful maternity care work, and starting to see its connection to just care and labor and delivery in the US, where I was still involved. And you guys might recognize these two folks. So Michael Brown on the left, this was the fall of 2014, I think. Oh, I think it was 2014. And then Freddie Gray died in Baltimore, which is my now new hometown, about 9 months later. And so there was kind of like obstetric violence. None of this violence was new, but it had a new urgency. People were aware of it in a new way. There was a new call for action. Groups like Black Lives Matter came into being. And so I'm not saying that these were the first or the last people to be affected by violence, but I can remember driving home during the unrest in Baltimore, and it was pretty chaotic. So you had, obviously similar scenarios here in Missouri. So the reason I make this point is that close to this time, a boss called me and asked me if I wanted to work on a public health course, and I had been really focused on the global work, and I thought, you know what, maybe in terms of service right now, it makes sense to focus on Baltimore, because I just drove home through I just skirted like around this unrest. My own personal target was like being like bashed in, and I felt personally affected. Like that's how close I got, which is not that close, but it was close enough that I felt it, and I thought, I don't even know the city that I've been living in, because I'm sort of in my little bubble in school and at work. So this is the context for a little bit of a shift. So I want to also put this in context and give you just a little bit, another snippet of that same CDC PDF that I started with to just demonstrate some of those disparities. So we know that those disparities, we see those disparities, for example, about the percentage of black men who are incarcerated, and we see these disparities in the number of women affected by maternal morbidity and mortality. And we can't ignore the fact that the burden is disproportionate. I actually found, right like in my hotel room where I came here, I've been looking for Missouri data, and so I apologize because these folks, are any of these people here? They were not from the University of Missouri, the affiliations, but I thought, wouldn't it be cool if they were here? This was like a poster that had been published in 2019, and it was the only Missouri-specific data I could find. So if anybody wants to correct me, but I think there's a lot happening actually in Missouri. They say that Missouri is 44th in terms of maternal mortality in the U.S., which, if that's correct, that's pretty good, right? But you still have, certainly everybody's got work to do, and as I understand it, the disparities are still there. So I just wanted to throw in that Missouri data because I found it fun. So I mentioned the fact that some of that concern about violence, right, was coming home to roost, and so that was in the just overall in the community. If we pull that violence into maternity care, we start to look at groups like Black Mamas Matter and Sister Song and the National Birth Equity Collaborative. These were groups that were really starting to get attention and have a voice in this issue around the disrespect that women were experiencing and the poor outcomes that we were seeing in those disparities. And so Battling Birth is a great collection of descriptions of women's experiences, and if you provide maternity care in the U.S., you should read these. It's pretty amazing and chilling. So how many people here are involved in service learning? Yeah. Okay, yeah, okay. I know, I sort of halfway hold up my hand too, because I'm still trying to figure it out. So we think about service learning is you go and you do service, and the reason we call it service learning and not just volunteer work is that there's that reflection piece, and you hopefully are growing and learning, right, as you do it. How about critical service learning? Anybody toy with that language or been introduced to it? Yeah? Okay. So I have a new hero in my life. Her name is Kelly Jacques. Do you want to take a stab at telling me how critical service learning is different than service learning? As the definitions go.
I can't really give the definition.
Sorry, I put you on the spot.
But it's way more reflective of your positionality, and it also centers the host community, the community you're going and working in, to be treated in a much more respectful and dignified way.
Yeah, I think that's a good way of putting it. And there's a really, my service learning hero at Hopkins, her name is Kelly Jacques, and she has introduced me to an author named Tanya Mitchell, who talked about critical service learning. The way they put it, the difference is critical service learning is done with the purpose of disrupting the dominant paradigm. This is not just about learning and providing a service, but I'm going to do this in a way that is going to affect change, create authentic relationships, and disrupt the norm. Service learning in general doesn't set out to do that. So it's service for the purpose of an ideal that you have. And that makes it feel different. And so when we think about, I think about the extent to which service learning can be incorporated into actions we take to try and reduce maternal morbidity, reduce mistreatment of women in the childbirth process. So I put this graphic together last night. It's not very perfect, but that's the intent for critical service learning, to affect social change, to redistribute power, and to create authentic relationships. And the extent to which we can reduce respectful maternity care is going to take all of those things. Those authentic relationships have to happen with the women who have not been treated very well and not heard. The change, the redistribution of power has to happen between providers and patients. I had a student in a class earlier today ask me if it was possible to ask a provider to tell them, but can you tell them you don't want to be induced? Yes. Yes. We've got to redistribute the power in those rooms. If only, and I hate to put the bar so low, if only to make sure that everyone who's having a kid knows they have a say in how this goes off. Right? They don't just have a say, they can call the shots. Do you want to inform them of the risks and benefits of certain choices? Of course, that's my job, that's other providers' jobs. But yes, you have a say, you better. We have got to redistribute that power. And then the first one is just creating change in that culture. That goes everything like, I might be doing a great job when I'm in the room with you, but if I come out and talk to my colleague at lunch or the break, the break room or whatever, at the report desk, and I am mocking you, and mocking the birth plan you walked in with, this is not respectful care, and that's going to start to permeate my relationship with that person, even though I walk in with a nice big smile on my face. And I'll show you some data. So quick first example is group antenatal care. Anybody heard of that? I know we got OB-GYN here, right? So, you familiar with it?
Yes, we do it.
Yeah, awesome. Tell us what it is. How's it different?
We do centering pregnancy, so 8 to 12 moms go through their pregnancy together.
Yep.
And it's been shown to just eliminate or make less health disparities, but also decrease preterm birth, decrease very low birth weight infants, decrease postpartum depression, improve breastfeeding outcomes, and we love it.
So, okay, that's a win-win. Providers love it, women love it, outcomes are better. Did you redistribute power? So now instead of, I'm just going to use the example, now it used to be in standard prenatal care, I'm going to basically have a very similar conversation with maybe 20 women today. I'm going to answer the same kind of question, give the same kind of advice. And it's pretty boring for me, and you get 10 minutes with me. In group care, you get 2 hours and 10 minutes with me, and the exchange is happening amongst the women. So not only are they getting the information, but they're building community and support. And when I answer your question correctly, and you say, that's exactly right, Nicole, and let me just add this one other piece, I feel great, because now I'm part of the teaching. And you got taught by me, you trust me, I'm part of your community, and you didn't really trust her anyway, she's not part of yours. So we're solving all kinds of problems. That's a redistribution of power. That's a change in the dominant paradigm. And it's building authentic relationships between the women that were not possible in standard care. So group antenatal care, just to show you a couple pictures, it's you said all of these things like very beautifully, so I won't go over them again. It started in the US, 8 sessions. They had a mental health focus. I worked on this project with a mental health, community-based mental health team. And end-line data collection is going on as we speak. So that's just one example of how you might apply elements of critical service learning into a very practice-oriented project to try and create that change, redistribute that power, and build authentic relationships that weren't there before. The other example is related to FGM, and I'll go through this quickly. ACOG used to provide a guide. How are we on time, just so I make sure that we're okay? Okay, we get to the end. ACOG used to provide, you can see how old that is because you see the CD-ROM, right? And I have to say, I like to do this anytime I give a talk. I go back into the ACOG store and I look again to see if it's there. They have finally taken this thing down. That has been on their website for years, and I often call and I ask if I can order it. And I'm usually told it is obsolete. Now, I told you the numbers of affected people went from about 170,000, 220 to 500,000. Do not tell me this is an obsolete piece of information. And so they have declined to have experts re-up their policy. I can't explain why. Anyway, this is in contrast to the federal government. Agencies like ICE, Customs and Border Patrol are extremely interested in trying to prevent FGC. They would really like to arrest families who are thinking about engaging in FGC for obvious reasons. They want to protect girls. But the way they are advancing that agenda is pretty much blowing up any hope of a good rapport with those communities. And if you, for example, are a Sudanese family who is Muslim in Minnesota, you probably don't want to give ICE any other reason or Customs and Border Patrol to come visit you or pull you aside in the airport. It's just trauma upon trauma, right? So we have this interesting dynamic where the feds are really the only source of money on this topic at this point, which is kind of sad. So we wanted to try and do something different. And working with my colleague Krista Johnson-Akpaku, who's an OB-GYN and has really been leading this, we developed a one-day educational workshop that had didactic and lectures and discussion. We're just trying to provide. And so we did some lectures, and then there was a lot of simulation and breakout sessions, and so practicing defibrillation, which is reversing the scar that is caused by some forms of FGC, and also practice screening and counseling. What are the things you want to talk to a client about when you realize they have a history of FGC? How deep do you go? How deep should you go? Do I need to go over this list? Should I go over that list? If they want to have their scar reversed, when should they do it? What kind of anesthesia? What stage of labor? It's a lot to cover, right? And so we really helped people. We used like an OSCE, which is basically almost like a simulated patient or a simulated patient interaction where it's very standardized what you have to cover, and we gauged participants' success in doing this both before and after the workshop. And we had very small numbers, but we saw significant improvements, which was great. That's the results on the left that are very preliminary. We did see significant improvements. And then on the right, we also did a CAP survey before and after the workshop, and we were able to compare that to another group of people who didn't do the workshop, who also did the pre and the post test. And we saw that we didn't really change knowledge in the two groups, but we saw a significant increase in confidence of the people who were at the workshop for their ability to screen and counsel. And this is very preliminary. Some of this just got run last week, so I apologize there's not more data here. So if we move on and think about changing some of this, I can't finish it off without talking about how we do it in classes. And because a lot of critical service learning, there's a community portion and there's a classroom portion when we talk about service learning. And so when I am teaching people about public health nursing or childbearing nursing, these are the two agencies I think about. So if we go back to RMC, just to remind you, has anyone, Boren basically put out a typology. She got a doctoral degree at the School of Public Health in Baltimore. Boren has a typology about mistreatment that basically everybody is using. Talk about the most, it's like the publication of your academic dreams. You would publish this first, and there is no other typology, so everybody cites yours. Everybody cites Boren. Okay? Great, very rigorous lit review. She deserves it. These are the categories of mistreatment she came up with. We compared it to qualitative data generated by students who took my class over the last 3 years. Every semester I asked them to write a 2-page paper. I had them look at the universal rights of childbearing women, generated in low and middle income settings for use there. And I asked them to reflect on the care that they participated in labor and delivery and see if they see any overlap. So we did a qualitative analysis of 292 of these analyses. And of these types, we saw every single one. Health systems, conditions, and restraints were much less likely to happen because we have rooms, we have beds, we have electricity, we have water, we have linens. But stigma, discrimination, the verbal abuse, poor provider, I mean, it just wasn't hard to find. Sexual abuse, we only had a couple, I'm glad, we only had a couple instances of those, and we had very specific definitions for what would be coded as this, but some forceful, non-consented vaginal exams we did code as sexual abuse in a couple of cases, because they were just, the description was so graphic, you couldn't really call it anything else. So that, as far as I know, is just, it's disturbing and it's real, and it's not long ago, it's not historical, it's every day in labor and deliveries all over this country. And it's not because nurses and midwives and docs are mean people, it's because they work in systems that do not allow them to call out or discuss with colleagues when they hear things that are concerning. And so we've kind of created a culture where that disrespect and that urgency is the norm, and we have got to undo that, and we can only do it by redistributing power. I think that's probably the most important thing. So I'll kind of wrap up here just by saying HRSA gave out 9 big maternal innovation grants. Maryland got one of them. It is led by an epidemiologist in maternal health, Andrea Cragnon in the School of Public Health. So it's $10 million over 5 years, and I'm sort of on the team. I was very fortunate to get on the team. I did nothing to get the grant. I wish I had, because I'd be so proud. I just got lucky enough to be put on the team. You know what, I was on her hiring committee when she came to Hopkins, and I think she just decided she liked me because she figured I must have been part of the team that voted her in. And she was like, hey, do you want to work on this? And I was like, yeah. So that's how I got in. I got lucky, right? But MD Mom is a great program, and one of the cool things about it is actually going to incorporate implicit bias training. So all perinatal providers in the state of Maryland will have to have implicit bias training. Does this work to move the needle on making mean comments to patients and being rude to them? We don't know. Everybody thinks implicit bias training is a good idea. It has not been tested. But the cool thing is, there was a legislator who was actually pushing through legislation to mandate implicit bias training at exactly the same time we got the grant. So we partnered with her, and when the bill was heard in the legislature, we were able to testify, and I got to sit right next to her and say, yes, we all want to do this, and I have lots of support. So what's cool is it's policy complementing practice, and hopefully we get the right amount of force and leverage to actually see if this works and test it and see if implicit bias really does help us out. So I'm going to bring this around and just kind of bring this back. When we think about Women's History Month, look, when I was a Peace Corps volunteer, I grew up in such a white environment. When I went to Peace Corps, this was literally the first time I had been around black people. And it wasn't just the first time I'd ever been around black people. Black people were running my life. Black people were in charge of everything around me because I was in West Africa, right? And so my first experience with people of color was leadership and power and management and a lot of very positive things, and I was taken great care of. And I think in my US context, my experience with people of color, it's taken me a while to recognize that I have to do more work to seek out and make sure those voices that are so easy to hear, right? For me at least, they were easy to hear in a place like West Africa, to make sure that those voices are heard here. I mean, that's not my job, but I need to be listening in a way that I hadn't been listening before. So when we think about Women's History Month, I can't help but think about, do you guys know who Joy Kruger is? She's probably like the leading advocate for Black Lives Matter in the United States. She's really like a phenom. Kiala Jacques, who's schooling me in critical service learning every week. Like, we have to find those voices that are going to help us change that power dynamic and create those relationships so that we can make the change. And I think for me that's the link that I'm seeing between service learning and Women's History Month. And most of that really came from Peace Corps and kind of pecking away every day at some of these broader global agendas like you have here. So I'm going to close it there and hope we have
I want to thank all of you for coming out and participating tonight. Let's open the floor for some questions. Does anybody have a question they'd like to ask Nicole?
Or each other.
Or each other? Or dialogue?
Hi, my name is Camila Lucas. I have a question about Janine Young and just the work that you all said and what you said that you were doing at Hopkins. Is there any way like we can follow that data or like just the when she publishes?
Yeah, so Janine Young, she's based in Denver, and she's a pediatrician, and she's easy to find online. And the American Academy of Pediatrics, like I said, they'll be the first professional organization to publish it. From what I understand from Janine, it's in final stages, like review of their legal team. But I'll be frank, it's been in that stage for like over a year. And so she will know exactly where it stands. She's understandably frustrated, but I would just keep, you know, when you keep looking for an update, you just keep Googling it again. I think you'll see, one day you're gonna be like, boom, there it is, it's published. You also can reach out to Janine, and she is very welcoming of people who want to join the drive to get pediatricians engaged in this issue. But yeah, so Janine Young, she's in Denver, easy to find and very responsive, and she's the leader of the pediatric guidelines. Yeah.
My name is Adu, I'm doing political science. So my question is about what do you think capacity has, what education capacity for LMC, especially in African countries where you go to hospitals and they are packed. And I guess this has an impact on how women are treated when they go to deliver.
It does. Right, so you could have Albright staff, but if there are no beds and you have to either have a baby on the floor or share a bed with someone else also having a baby, like that's pretty stressful, even if the providers are all smiles and positive, right? So I think in low middle income settings, some of the challenges are truly structural, and those changes will only happen with, I mean, we have to go way up the food chain here, improved governance of healthcare financing, new models of healthcare financing. We can't just make beds appear and make hospitals appear out of nowhere, but it's more careful stewardship and control of government dollars, agency dollars, and I think that is going to come from the people who run those countries. What are your thoughts on that? Because those are big infrastructure issues that get a little bit out of my expertise. What do you think?
No, I agree. I think the infrastructure is like one of the main points. So, like from the witnesses that I've heard from women that I personally know, it's like you go and like, okay, there are many people waiting for you and you have to go real quick so that the other person can come in.
Yeah,
when maybe there are some complications, then the provider becomes impatient, and then abuses get in.
Yeah. And so I think that's one of those kinds of, you know, we consider that a form of disrespect and abuse to have to experience that, but it's something we see less of in the US, but is a really common thing, especially in a really packed, like I'm imagining a very packed urban hospital in a, you know, in a busy capital city, that kind of thing. Yep, yep. Women here just couldn't even get their head around having to share a bed with someone in labor, right? I mean, I don't want to say all things are relative, but there's a few things that are relative. Anybody else? Yeah.
So
we, in trying to do our centering, part of my own personal motivation is to try and empower patients to speak up, because often hospital policy lends itself to abuse of patients or manipulation of patients. But what's interesting in Missouri is whenever there is any sort of discrepancy, the impulse is to say, well, we're just going to do what's in the best interest of the baby, even if that means, forcing a mom to have a C-section or forcing a mom to do something. And it seems like the law sides on the side of the baby often.
Yep.
So how do you combat that when you know what the patient's rights are, but legally they won't be upheld?
So I automatically want to defer to my hero, Monica McLemore, because reproductive justice really does center the woman. And like you said, that's in conflict with this almost like you can't even argue with someone who says, well, this is in the best interest of the baby. There are lots of folks out there that would say, no, I'm actually the priority here, not the fetus. And so some of those are sort of, when it gets to, obviously if you're talking about a viable fetus, sometimes the conversations even get more complicated. I don't have an answer to that question because you're right, there's a woman in California, in San Diego, who deals very specifically with this, I don't even know if it's slow anymore, but this legislative preference for fetal and newborn well-being over maternal preference, even in the case of like forced C-section. So I would refer you to her work, and I think I have her name, but this is like her career, her area of study, is that shift and what that takes away from the autonomy of the woman in those kinds of moments, and I don't know. Can I ask you, you mentioned something about policy in the hospital, and that's such a good example of sort of structural mistreatment. Can you give an example of what you mean by policies that disempower women?
So one of, for example, some of the things we've had come across would be like a mom not being able to breastfeed if she's marijuana positive. And like separating.
There's a policy in your hospital for that?
Mm-hmm. And separating the mom who tries to latch her baby on in the NICU, not allowing her to come into the NICU to see her baby because she's breastfeeding her baby against medical advice, or taking the baby from custody from the parents for a period of time to do vitamin K injection.
Wait, I'm sorry, can you just repeat that?
So basically we had to meet with like the whole legal team because the pediatricians would take the baby from the parents if they were declining vitamin K and give it and say it was for the best interest of the baby. And sort of these things were just accepted as okay treatment of people because it was for the baby.
Oh my God, I'm every day I'm like sort of humbled. That is such a disturbing string of scenarios that you just shared.
There's a reason I'm in therapy.
Oh my God. But I have an exclamation, but I'm gonna restrain myself. That is, wow, join the fight, you're obviously in the fight. And this is the thing, students hear this stuff about mistreatment, and they write these short-written assignments, and we talk about this stuff, and they go into these units, and they're just like, guns blazing, like, this is horrible, we gotta fix this. And I'm like, you guys, I'm so glad you're inspired, but if you do that, and if you were a nurse, first of all, they might not invite us back as a student group, and we need these groups, right? We need these clinical slots, so there's that, we have to be good guests. And if you did that as a new nurse, you'd probably end up fired, if not sort of the pariah on the unit. So teaching people to take that passion, that energy, and engage in sustainable quality improvement. So if you can put it through, this is why I'm taking this really painful year-long quality and safety thing, because I'm like, if I can frame RMC as a quality and safety issue, people recognize that and they don't roll their eyes as much. And so I think learning to dismantle some of those policies, it's going to take somebody who is absolutely committed to doing it, who's going to be persistent and smiley and keep pushing through that change, and find your advocates and push. But it's going to be slow and painful, but it won't happen any other way. But that you just shared some pretty disturbing violations of any parent's rights. Vitamin K is like, I don't want to belittle, it's a great intervention, but they don't have to take it. And I'm like, and you know what, some of these families, they're so stressed with just being families, they don't understand. You could sue the pants off of that facility for that kind of stuff. And I almost want to go whisper in their ear, you should get a good lawyer, take them. Sorry, that doesn't sound right, but that's how unaware I think people are of their rights. That's crazy.
Well, it's usually not empowered patients that are white and have means.
Exactly.
Generally patients who have a hard time finding a voice anyway.
And you gotta pick and choose your battles. And today I can't do one more. And God, that is just, wow, super disturbing.
So I'm aware that maybe this is now less common, but from your research in Mali, and how do you think this respectful maternal care impact the willingness to deliver at home instead of going to a hospital? Have you come across cases like this?
Yeah, so Mali, like many countries, had really a nice big uptick in facility-based births, which was great. But there wasn't necessarily the uptick in the number of providers and beds, and so sometimes they struggle to meet demand, especially in bigger cities. It has been years, because Mali is unfortunately now a bit of a hotspot in the terrorism world, and I have not been back out to the rural communities in a few years. And I've been back to Bamako frequently and recently, and they don't have a challenge really with facility-based births in Bamako. I think the rate of facility-based births in Bamako is probably about 90% now, but Bamako is the capital. So I can't really say what's happening in the rural setting. I wish I could. Because I can't go there, but there's lots of people who can't go anywhere else, and so we don't know what's happening. I don't know what's happening.
So I have kind of a question, but also a comment. I just want to share that you may have heard of this organization who is part of Support International. They are the only organization that nationally certifies providers to be able to treat perinatal mood disorders. They are coming to Colombia April 1st through the 3rd. That third day, providers can opt to take the psychopharmacology or psychotherapy option on that third day to make you eligible to be able to receive that certification. That is here in Colombia, and you can go out to the website Postpartum Support International to sign up. There is a student rate available, so I just wanted to throw that out there. Great resource here in Colombia.
And the hopefully obvious tie-in to this is that some of the leading causes depends on the age and the state. Some of the leading causes of maternal morbidity and mortality are related to mental health sequelae, everything from suicide to just chronic depression. I mean, this has profound intergenerational effects, not just for the parent, but for the babies. We know those babies don't do as well in a variety of ways. So just to kind of buttress, like this is maternal morbidity and mortality we're talking about when we talk about mental health. So thanks for raising that issue, because I should have mentioned it. It is a component of the MD Mom program, I just want to say.
Yes, and then the other thing I just wanted to kind of ask you about and just mention first off is that if you all are aware, I'm not sure if you all are aware, but in St. Louis, somebody who I think is really kind of pioneering that redistribution of power is her, I can't remember her last name. First name is True with Jamal Birth Village. She's a certified nurse midwife, and I think she was one of the first Black certified nurse midwives in Missouri. She is a great example of that redistribution of power, so I would definitely check out Jamal Birth Village. True is her name. She's been nationally featured as well. And I just wanted to ask you then about kind of what your thoughts are as far as like doulas and kind of that redistribution of power.
So I was in a couple classrooms earlier today, and I didn't even put Mitchell's in the references list at the bottom, but I didn't cite it on here, so sorry. So all this change, redistribution of power, and authentic relationships, that's Mitchell Critical Service Learning, highly recommended. It totally re-inspired me when I read it on, again, felt like the 6th time on the plane. So I'm flipping to this because I wanted to go back to, so doulas, if doulas were a drug, it would be unethical not to give it. Meaning that the outcomes are so obviously positive, like it literally would be unethical not to give something that we know works so well. The unfortunate side of doula is not their fault, but our fault, I think, on the sort of, I guess this is farther back than I thought, sorry, is doulas, like birth plans, tend to make the provider staff, there's like an antagonistic relationship. I mean, am I right?
I think there are doulas that work great in the hospital system, and there are doulas that hate the hospital system.
Yes.
And that doesn't always help the patient.
Right. So I think, look, the maternal fetal medicine, Society for Maternal Fetal Medicine, which is like the high-risk docs, they have come out and said we have got to minimize interventions. One of the key strategies for doing this is doulas. So this is MFM talking now, right? Like that usually gets people's attention. That's great. It's too bad we needed them, but it's helpful. But I think they're like an untapped resource. I think that adversarial relationship that some midwives have with facilities or certain providers can actually create some harm. But overall, I mean, if they're like, it's like, duh, like, of course. And I actually find I have to sell women on them because they have misperceptions about, they think the doula is going to like replace their spouse. Like, no, you know, my husband or whatever, we really want to do this together. And I try and explain a good doula will help you have a good experience together. They don't replace that person. They help put them to work in ways that aren't terrifying for that person. And so is there like a challenge against doulas in Missouri? Do you feel like they're not, no?
Oh, sorry, I was just going to say my perception has been just kind of nationally that just kind of, you know, with like the legislation trying to be passed to get like a certain particular type of education or like to kind of like that accreditation as a doula that's nationally recognized, kind of just things I guess from what I've heard and other speakers talk about, kind of that challenge of being a doula and kind of feeling like they're becoming more disempowered.
And if you put on those credentialing, you know, standards, you might actually limit access. It's already expensive. But you know, the cool thing is, part of the omnibus bills, one of those fantastic bills, is about doulas being covered through Medicaid. Very nice. Duh! Like, isn't that the best idea ever? Thank you, Lauren Underwood and the Black Maternal Health Caucus. I think I have that right. So like, we have just got to let women of color lead the way. They're clearly suffering the most. And so like, I am ready and willing to do what these groups want. But it's just tough. Like sometimes I wake up, I'm like, why am I a middle-aged white woman doing this? I need to decenter my enthusiasm, but it's just a tricky line, like trying to figure out how to use your power and privilege when you know, but I can't see and hear what I see and hear at work and not be taking action either. So, yeah.
Regarding the doula thing, so in my hospital, obviously, you know, there's a national initiative to decrease C-section rate.
Yeah.
So we know doulas decrease C-section rate, decrease intervention, and so, you know, kind of like you were saying, like why doesn't everybody just have one? So, you know, we have these child life specialists, like for your kid, you know, if you're going to surgery and they have like iPads and they like help you. So I was like, well, why don't we have like labor life specialists?
We just have to rename them, right, to get them.
But I'm not sure if the outcomes, what do you think? Do you think the outcomes would be the same if they were hired by the hospital?
So there is some data like
the independentness that helps.
Yeah, I do think that helps, but I feel like the key to what makes doulas great, why the outcomes are so good, is that they can't have those clinical responsibilities. Like we thought, well, maybe if the nurse was in the room all the time, that would be as good as doula. It wasn't. It wasn't, because the nurse has got to do all this other stuff, right? So I feel like the key is that they don't have that clinical responsibility, they have a support responsibility. So, I don't know. Yeah, and then, you know, there's a hospital near me that I find to be one of the least evidence-based places I have ever seen, and they have a doula service. I just need to be cautious. They have a doula service, and they use that word, and I think it attracts people, but the services they're providing are not what I would recognize as a doula service. The hospital actually has used them in a way to really further, I think, control of the childbearing experience. So I think we have to make sure that, what do you mean when you say doula? Because it's become a bit of it's got a little cachet. So anyway, there's that. So anyway, lots of work to do. And yeah, anything else?
Let's give Nicole another round. Yeah.